In the previous lesson, we looked at the origin of life on Earth, and we used the Drake equation to set the context. N is the number of communicating civilizations in our galaxy. Here's the Milky Way galaxy here. This was taken at Joshua Tree. Night sky here, and the sun is rising over here on the left, so we see the approach of dawn. R sub star would be the number of stars formed per year in the galaxy. F sub p would be the fraction of those stars that have planets. And then we looked at N sub e, the number of habitable worlds per star system. And Earth, of course, is one of these habitable worlds. We went on to then look at the origin of life. That's F sub L. And the remaining terms then would be the fraction of worlds where the life gets intelligent, F sub I, communicating, F sub c, and then the length of the civilization in years. The origin of life then is an example of spontaneous generation. Non-living molecules from the chemistry happening in these small little chambers is one leading idea. Those molecules assembled into a living entity, a cell, and we'll call that LUCA. In this lesson then, we'll try to figure out how simple cells operate. And our example is a simple bacteria type of cell, and here's our cartoon bacteria cell. So the basic unit of life on Earth is a cell. All living things on Earth share many of the features of this first and simplest kind of cell, a bacteria cell. We learned that the boundary of the cell is the cell membrane. It's a flexible boundary. Now, some cells have a more rigid cell wall as well, but the membrane is shared by all cells. The membrane performs important jobs. It confines molecules within a small volume so that they can interact and perform the chemistry of life. In addition, the cell membrane controls the flow of materials into the cell and waste out of the cell. And the cell controls this by way of proteins. So proteins inserted into the membrane are like channels, gateways for larger molecules to enter the cell and leave. This makes the cell membrane selectively permeable. We learned that cells acquire energy from the environment. We can call that food. So in the case of a cell is composed of molecules, and so it eats molecules as food. Other cells will harness the energy of sun, but these early cells were eating molecules in their environment. So they transport food molecules into the cell where chemistry will happen. Now, how is it that food molecules store energy? We learned that the energy of a food molecule is stored in its chemical bond. And why is that? Because to make a chemical bond, you have to push atoms close enough together. But the electrons in those atoms will repel. There will be a force of repulsion here. So it takes energy to move these atoms close enough together to form the chemical bond. So the energy it takes to make the chemical bond is stored in the chemical bond. So when proteins inside the cell start to break the chemical bonds of food molecules, energy is released. And we call this chemistry metabolism. Now we learned that the cell is going to transform the abundant energy in a large complex food molecule like glucose into energy molecules called ATP. ATP molecules store smaller quantities of energy, and the cell has a whole specialized machinery, a set of proteins in the cell membrane that will, in a sense, convert the energy of glucose into the energy carried by ATP molecules. And the cells are going to use the ATP molecules to do chemical reactions, to power the chemistry of life. And part of that chemistry is to build molecules. So the cell will import nutrients, and these nutrient molecules may have to be stuck together, chemically combined, and proteins can do that job using the energy supplied by ATP. So in this scene, a protein is joining the green and the red molecule to form a larger, more complex molecule. So proteins need ATP energy to join molecules. In order to make the chemical bond between the red and the green molecule, you have to force them close enough together, and that takes energy. And we said that ATP has just the right amount of energy to do this kind of chemistry, whereas a food molecule like glucose has way more energy than is needed to power these kinds of chemical reactions. So the cell converts the energy of glucose into a bunch of these ATP molecules with just the right amount of energy to perform useful chemical reactions. And we also noted then, because the proteins that convert energy from glucose into ATP, because those proteins are on the cell membrane, then the surface area of the cell is what limits energy production. But the energy needs of a cell are related to the volume of the cell. So as the cell gets bigger, the surface area does indeed get bigger, but the volume gets bigger faster. So when cells grow, they face an energy shortage. So cells must remain small. They can do this by dividing. So a large parent cell will divide into two smaller offspring. We have learned then that these proteins are parts with purpose. And this is the interesting thing about living things. They have these parts with purpose. Now, in the 1800s, lots of folks argued that if you see something with a purpose, it had an intelligent designer. Well, Mr. Charles Darwin will come along and give us an explanation for how living things are equipped with these parts with purpose. And it's an evolutionary process that we'll study a little bit later. But we'll just note now that all of these important parts that have purposes, all these proteins do have purposes. They have jobs. They have specific tasks to perform. This protein imports food. These proteins start to break down glucose. These proteins convert the energy of food into ATP. These proteins are building things. There's protein construction. Proteins do all manner of jobs in the cell, and they have certain purposes. Now, proteins are chain molecules built from 20 different building blocks called amino acids. So the sequence of amino acids determines how it folds up into a three-dimensional shape, and it's the shape that will determine what kind of job it can do. And the reason is that the atoms that make up a protein are unequally sharing electrons, and this generates surface charges on the protein. So that means this protein has sort of different kinds of surface charges, positive regions and negatively charged regions, and then that means that other molecules can stick to the protein at certain locations. So this particular protein has a set of surface charges that will allow it to bind the red molecule right here and bind the green molecule right here, so they will stick, and that allows the protein then to make that chemical bond. So complex molecules have surface charges due to unequal sharing of electrons, and that's what allows this particular protein to only interact with this particular red molecule and this particular green one to perform this particular chemical reaction. So different proteins interact with different molecules and so can perform different chemical reactions. They have different functions. And because proteins have a purpose in the cell, they are molecular adaptations. We'll learn that adaptations are these features of creatures that serve some useful purpose for the organism to help it live or reproduce. And we can think of a cell then as having molecular adaptations. Proteins are like these molecular adaptations at the cell level. And so, not only then did chemistry on the Earth, perhaps in these undersea volcanic vents, produce a living cell, here's Luca here, but the subsequent evolution of cells improved the function of some of these early proteins and went on to produce new proteins that could perform new functions. And this then allowed for life to become larger, more complex, and more intelligent. So in our Drake equation then, we're going to see that as cells evolved, they changed over time, leading to the emergence of intelligent life on the planet. And so it was then that Luca emerged in the depths of the oceans, and its descendants were able to colonize the land. And we know some of these complex multi-celled descendants as plants. This is Joshua Tree again. And animals. This is Death Valley. There's the Milky Way. And some of those animals have achieved a level of intelligence that allows them to ponder the nature of their own existence.